Mrs. Kingsley, you've missed 2 evaluations. You're getting up now, and you're coming with us.
14 across.
6 letters. A person nobody asked. I'll be with you when I've got it. This isn't a request, Mrs. Kingsley. Nothing you people say ever is. That's rather the whole trouble with you. You've missed 2 evaluations. I've made every one. I simply keep passing them, and you keep not liking the results, and so we call it missing. You've said you were taking me 3 times now.
I got my pen.
And yet here I sit. One might almost think I keep getting away.
And one for the lady at the window, on me. Don't tell her. Morning. I know that lady. She's in here every day. Somebody want to tell me why it takes 4 grown men to move somebody who doesn't weigh 100 pounds?
Because 4 might not be enough. I'm 80, I weigh nothing, and I terrify them. It's the ink. A woman who does the crossword in ink can't be managed.
This is a protected person matter. You can wait outside.
I'm the mail carrier. I'm allowed to be anywhere the mail is.
He nodded at the table. She getting any today? Because I've had this route 15 years, and her box has been empty every single morning of it. He buys my coffee, Beverly. Estelle still had not looked up. And he pretends I don't know it. He's the only one who stood in this shop in 5 months and asked me a question instead of answering one for me. Mrs. Kingsley is confused this morning, Coulter said to the room, not to her. Mrs. Kingsley is doing a crossword, Estelle said, in ink. Ask the mailman what that means. Means you don't plan on being wrong, Josiah said. Means I never am. She finally looked up. At him. Only at him. So before 4 men walk me out of a coffee shop, Mr. Rhodes, I'd take it kindly if you'd make one of them say out loud that they asked me and I said yes. Because nobody's asked me anything since March. Nobody said anything. The espresso machine hissed and quit. Josiah Rhodes had been paying for the lady at the window's coffee every morning for 5 months, and he'd thought he was buying a poor widow a small kindness. He did not know her name was worth a fortune. He did not know the 4 men had a piece of paper that made her disappearing legal, and he did not know that he was about to do the one thing he had spent 16 years and a whole mail route trying to make up for, which was fail to save an old woman the world had already decided to forget. To understand why a letter carrier would step between 4 men and a court order over a woman he only knew from a coffee shop, you have to understand a woman named Odessa. Josiah was 39, and he had walked the same route on the north side for 15 years, and he was raising his boy alone, and the reason the empty mailbox was the loneliest thing he knew was his grandmother. Odessa Rhodes had raised him. His own mother had been young and overwhelmed, and gone before he had memories. And it was Odessa's kitchen he grew up in, Odessa's church. Odessa's hand on the back of his neck, steering him through a hard neighborhood without a scratch on his record. She was the one who told him he was going to be somebody. When she got old and her hip went and the confusion started, the family did what families do when there's more love than money and more hours in a shift than there are in a day. They put her in a facility, Sunrise something. It had a nice sign, and they visited at first. And then the visits got further apart, the way they do, because the drive was long and the place smelled like the end, and Odessa didn't always know you, and it broke your heart to go. So you went less. So it broke your heart more. So you went even less. Josiah was 22 and working 2 jobs and telling himself he'd go Sunday. The thing he could not get out of himself, the thing that made him a mail carrier, was this. Every single time he did go, his grandmother, who had stopped knowing his name, would light up and ask the same question. Not, "Who are you?" Not, "How are you?" She would grip his sleeve and ask, "Did anybody send anything? Did the mail come? Did anybody write to me?" And the answer, for 2 years, was no. Nobody wrote to Odessa Rhodes. Her box in the facility mailroom, slot number, had her name on a strip of tape and nothing behind it, ever. And she checked it, or asked about it, every day, because somewhere under the fog she still believed that if you were a person, somebody, somewhere, would send you something to prove it. She died on a Tuesday with the tape still on the empty slot. Josiah was 23 days from a visit he'd been meaning to make. He didn't fall apart. He got quiet, the way the men in his family got quiet, and 8 months later he took the postal exam. And he had been carrying the mail for 15 years since. And if you asked him why he liked it, he'd tell you the hours were good and the pension was real. He would not tell you the true thing, which he'd said out loud exactly once to his boy on the porch, without meaning to. Nobody disappears on my route. He'd meant it small, a carrier's pride. I know every box, I hold nothing back. If there's something for you, you get it. But it had gotten into him bigger than that, over the years. The way a thing you say out loud does. It had become a rule about who he was responsible for seeing, and on his route, at 1490 Ferndale, a tall, narrow house behind an overgrown hedge, there was a brass mailbox that had been empty every morning for years. He didn't know who lived there. He only knew the specific silence of a box nobody wrote to, because he'd stood in front of that silence at a facility mailroom when he was 23. He didn't know, until the morning the 4 men came, that the lady from the window and the empty box at 1490 Ferndale were the same person. Her name, before it was a case number, was Estelle. That was all Josiah had of her for the first month. Estelle, the sharp old woman at the window table of the Bluebird who did the crossword in pen, and had opinions about everything and never, ever had anyone with her. She wore a good wool coat gone thin at the cuffs. She drank a small coffee, black, and made it last 2 hours. And Josiah, who came in every morning between the first half of his route and the second, had watched her count out coins for it one day, actual coins, a dime at a time, and had quietly told Dawn behind the counter to put the lady's coffee on his tab from then on and not to say who. That's a nice thing, Dawn had said. Dawn owned the place, 50 and unimpressed by most things. You know, she knows, right? Woman does the crossword in ink. She's known since the second day. Then we won't embarrass each other about it, Josiah said, and that was that. They talked, the way you talk to somebody you see every morning and never anywhere else. Crossword clues mostly. 7 letters, she'd say, not looking up, as he came in with the mail heavy on his shoulder. Delivered too late to matter. That's not a real clue. It's a real feeling. 7 letters. Overdue? That's 8. And it's not a feeling. It's a library fine. But her mouth would do the small thing it did when he'd amused her, which was most mornings. Try again tomorrow, Mr. Rhodes. You've got the mind for it. You just don't trust it. My grandmother used to say that. Then your grandmother was right, and you should have listened. And you'll spend the rest of your life learning she was right, which is what grandmothers are for. She'd fill in a word in ink, 9 across. A kindness performed in secret, so the giver won't have to be thanked. 6 letters. He'd looked at her that morning, and she'd looked right back at him over the top of the paper, and neither of them said coffee. And that was the closest they ever came, for months, to saying the true thing out loud. She had a dry, level way of talking that made you feel like you'd passed a test you didn't know you were taking. She never told him a single thing about herself, and he never asked, because he understood without a word passing about it, that she came to that window to be nobody in particular, and that being nobody in particular was, for her, a kind of freedom he wasn't going to take away by getting nosy. He assumed she was poor. The coins, the thin cuffs, the aloneness. He assumed she was a widow whose people had died or drifted, and that the Bluebird was the whole of her day, and it made him think of Odessa, and so he bought the coffee, and that was the size of it. He brought Micah in sometimes. Micah was 6, and he had decided the mail was the most important job in the world because his daddy did it, and he collected the rubber bands that came around the bundles, hundreds of them, wound into a ball the size of a grapefruit that he was very serious about. Micah took one look at the lady at the window and did what 6-year-olds do, which is go straight up to the thing the adults are being careful about. "Are you the lady my dad buys the coffee for?" "Micah," Josiah said. "I'm allowed to ask." Micah studied her. "Why don't you have anybody with you?" And Estelle, who had cut corporate men to pieces in her day and buried a husband and a son, and did not flinch at much, looked at a 6-year-old with a rubber band ball and said, after a moment, "I outlived them, child. That's the trick nobody warns you about. You spend your whole life afraid of losing people. And then one day you've done it, all of them, and you're the one left holding the door." Micah absorbed this the way children absorb the true things, without drama. Then he said the thing that started everything. "Your mailbox is always empty. On Ferndale. My dad says so." He said it like a fact that needed fixing, the way a leak needs fixing. "Is that your house? The tall one?" Something went across Estelle's face. Josiah saw it and didn't understand it yet. "It is," she said. "You never get any mail," Micah said. "Not ever. My dad noticed. He notices the empty ones. It makes him sad." He considered the problem. "I'll write you one. Then it won't be empty." He did. That week, at the kitchen table with the fat crayons, Micah Rhodes wrote a letter to a woman he'd met once. And it said in the enormous, uneven capitals of a 6-year-old, "Dear lady at the window, this is so your mailbox is not empty. My dad says everybody should get something. Here is a picture of my rubber band ball. It is big, from Micah." And Josiah, on his route, slid it into the brass box at 1490 Ferndale behind the overgrown hedge, and told himself it was a nice thing his boy had done and thought no more about it. He found out later what it did. He found out that Estelle Kingsley, who had a portfolio a bank managed and a house appraisers salivated over and a name that had been on a building downtown, took a crayon letter out of a brass box that afternoon and sat down on the 3rd step of her own front stairs and could not get up for a while, because it was the first piece of mail that had come to that house, for her, from a person who wanted nothing, in longer than she could stand to count. Cards from the guardian's office, yes. Statements, notices, but not a letter, not a person reaching across the world to say, "I thought of you, here is a thing I made." She kept it in the inside pocket of the thin wool coat, against her chest, and she was keeping it there the morning the 4 men came. Here's what Josiah didn't know, standing between those men and that table, and what he'd learn over the next terrible weeks. 5 months earlier, Estelle Kingsley had gotten a urinary infection. It happens to the old. It can scramble the mind for a few days, make a sharp woman foggy and frightened and strange. She'd been found confused on her own street. She'd spent 4 days in a hospital getting fixed, and on the 3rd of those days, while she was still not herself, a woman in a gray suit had appeared at her bedside with a clipboard and a sympathetic voice and a stack of forms. And by the time the infection cleared, and Estelle Kingsley was herself again, completely, verifiably herself, she was no longer, in the eyes of the law, a person who got to decide anything. She was a ward. Beverly Coulter was her guardian, and Beverly Coulter ran a company called Meridian Guardianship, and Estelle was one of 40-some human beings Coulter protected, which is to say controlled, which is to say billed. Coulter decided where Estelle lived, and what she ate, and whether she could have a phone, and how her money moved, and every hour of that deciding was invoiced to Estelle's own estate at a rate Estelle was not permitted to see. The house was going to be sold. Coulter had already met with the realtor. Estelle was going to be moved to a memory care facility that paid Meridian a placement fee, whether or not Estelle had any memory problems, because a woman in a locked facility is a woman who stops arguing about the invoices. The one thing Coulter had not counted on was that Estelle Kingsley, 80 years old and stripped of every legal right, was still the sharpest person in any room she was in. Coulter had cut off her phone, so Estelle used the pay phone at the library on her walks. Coulter had limited her cash. So Estelle counted coins and made a small coffee last 2 hours at a window where, it turned out, a mail carrier had been quietly buying her the next one. And in a drugstore notebook she kept inside a hollowed-out hardcover on a shelf Coulter's inspectors never checked, Estelle Kingsley had been writing everything down. Every invoice she caught a glimpse of, every name of every other old person she met who told her the same story. Every lie, in ink. She wasn't a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a woman building a case with the only tools a ward is left. Her eyes, her memory, and a $2 notebook. She just needed one person on the outside who'd believe a woman the state had labeled unable to know her own mind. She'd been looking for 5 months at the man who bought her coffee and never let her thank him, and said, "I'd like to hear her say she wants to go," Josiah said again, into the silence of the coffee shop. Beverly Coulter's patience was a thing she wore like the suit. "Sir, I appreciate that you've been kind to Mrs. Kingsley, but you don't understand the situation, and you're not equipped to. She has a diagnosed decline. She's under a court-ordered guardianship. She wandered from her residence this morning. Again. And my team is here to return her safely. That's all this is. A welfare check." She turned back to the table. "Estelle, please." "She's doing the crossword," Josiah said, "in ink." "You do the crossword in ink when you're not confused about anything." He didn't know if that was true. It felt true. Across the table, Estelle's mouth moved very slightly, the ghost of something. "Are you a doctor?" Coulter asked him. "No." "A lawyer? A relative? Anyone with standing?" "I'm the guy who's known this neighborhood 15 years and can tell you that woman is more with it than you are." He heard himself and reined it back. "I'm asking for one thing. Ask her, out loud, in front of everybody. Does she want to go with you?" Coulter did not ask her. Coulter nodded, and the 4 men moved, not roughly. Webb Dolan, at the front of them, was almost gentle, a big man with a tired face who had done this many times. And they had Estelle up out of the chair with a hand under each elbow before Josiah could get around the table. And her coffee tipped and spread dark across 14 across. And the last thing Estelle Kingsley did before they walked her out was turn her head and look, not at Coulter, not at the men, but at Josiah, and say 6 words very clearly. 14 across was "Unseen, Mr. Rhodes." And then she was gone, out into the cold and into a black SUV, and the bell over the door rang, and the coffee shop was very quiet, and Josiah Rhodes stood there, with his mail satchel and 2 cold cups, and understood that he had just watched them do it again, walk an old woman out of the light, and into a place where nobody would write to her, right off his route. "Joe," Dawn said from behind the counter, careful. "That was Estelle Kingsley. I know her name's Estelle." "No." Dawn set down the rag. "Kingsley. As in the Kingsley building. As in, Joe, that woman is worth about $40 million. Josiah looked at the spilled coffee soaking into the newspaper. "Then how come," he said slowly, "she's been counting out dimes for a small black coffee for 5 months. He went to the tall house on Ferndale that afternoon, off the clock, because a mail carrier can knock on the door on his own route without anybody thinking twice, and a man in a suit answered it. Meridian had a man in the house now, for the transition, and told Josiah the property was in conservatorship and he'd need to leave. Josiah left, but he'd seen, past the man's shoulder, the front hall of a house being quietly emptied. Rugs rolled, a china cabinet with tape on it, the particular look of a life being packed up by people who never lived in it. And he'd seen, on the little table by the door where you drop the mail, a stack of unopened envelopes, all of them windowed, all of them official, and lying on top of the stack, alone, a folded piece of paper covered in crayon. She'd carried it home. Out of everything in that house worth $40 million, the thing she'd set on top was his son's letter. Josiah drove home and sat in the truck in front of his own place for a while before he went in, because his hands weren't steady. And when Micah asked him what was wrong, he said, "Nothing, Micah. And it was the first time he'd lied to his son. And Micah, who was 6 and not stupid, knew. He tried the right way first. He always tried the right way first. It was the thing his grandmother had drilled into a black boy in a hard city. You do it clean. You do it by the book. Because they will be looking for a reason. He called Adult Protective Services and was told the matter was already under court supervision, which meant, in effect, that the system that had done this to Estelle considered the situation handled. He called the county and got a recording. He asked at the post office, and his supervisor, a decent man named Ott, told him gently and firmly to be careful, Sintupt. You start inserting yourself into a rich lady's guardianship, Joe. You're a black man with a key to every house on the north side and a lot of time alone with people's mail. Think about how that looks if somebody wants it to look bad. Stay in your lane. Ott wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. Ott was protecting him, and the advice was to look away, and it was exactly the advice the whole system was built to give. He found Renee Hutton at a legal aid clinic that did elder law, a young attorney with 200 cases and a coffee-stained blazer, and she listened to the whole thing and rubbed her eyes and said, I believe you. I want you to hear me say I believe you, because you're not going to hear it much. Predatory guardianship is the most legal crime in America. She's got a judge's order, a doctor's finding, a professional guardian with a clean record on paper. And your evidence is, she does the crossword in pen, and she's nice to your kid. Renee spread her hands. I can file to challenge capacity, but she'll be evaluated by a doctor the court trusts, and Coulter will make sure that doctor sees her on a bad afternoon, medicated, tired, rattled. They win these. They win these almost every time. The only thing that ever cracks one open is a witness on the inside, or a paper trail, and wards don't have either, because the whole point of a ward is she can't get to a phone or a lawyer or a pen. She's got a pen, Josiah said. I saw her. She's been writing something down for 5 months. Renee Hutton went very still. If that's true, she said, and if we can get to it, that changes everything. But Joe, they've got her now, in a locked facility. No visitors except approved. No phone. You understand what that means? Whatever she's been writing, it's in that house or on her. And she's somewhere you and I can't reach, and Coulter is going to keep her there, quiet, until the house is sold and the challenge window closes. That's not cruelty. That's just the calendar. They run out the clock. They always run out the clock. They ran out the clock. For 3 weeks, Estelle Kingsley was somewhere Josiah couldn't reach, a memory care wing with a keypad door, where a lucid woman was filed among the failing, which is its own particular hell, because there is no one to talk to and everyone assumes your protests are symptoms. Coulter cut the coffee shop out of the picture entirely. There was nothing to cut, since Estelle couldn't leave. The window table at the Bluebird sat empty. Dawn made a small black coffee every morning anyway and set it at the window and let it go cold, and told Josiah she didn't know why she did it. And Josiah knew exactly why, because he'd built a 15-year career out of the same refusal to let an empty space just be empty. And Micah asked every few days whether the lady got his letter and whether he could write another. And Josiah kept saying yes to the second question because he couldn't stand to answer the first. And there was a growing stack of crayon letters on the kitchen counter addressed to a woman a keypad door away that a mail carrier had no way to deliver. Josiah started to come apart the quiet way. He'd get to Ferndale on his route and stand in front of that empty brass box and feel 23 years old again, in a facility mailroom, in front of a slot with tape on it, and he understood with a flat, sick clarity that he had done exactly the thing he'd built his whole life around not doing. He had let an old woman disappear, off his route, again. He stopped bringing Micah to the Bluebird. He stopped saying the coffee line. Dawn watched him go gray around the edges and didn't push. And then one night, she pushed because that's what the good ones do. You're doing the thing you do, she said. You're deciding it's already lost so you can stop looking. You did it with your grandma. You told me once, the Sunday you didn't get to. You've been running a mail route for 15 years to pay a dead woman back for one Sunday, and it hasn't worked. And it's never going to work, Joe, because she's gone and you can't mail forgiveness to a grave. Dawn's voice was not unkind. Estelle's not gone. That's the difference you keep missing. You still have time with this one. Don't waste it being sorry about the last one. Josiah didn't answer, which was the answer. And he went home. And Micah was still up. And Micah looked at his father's face and said the thing that put the nail through him. You said nobody disappears on your route, Daddy. He wasn't accusing. He was 6 and confused and trying to understand the rules. She was on your route. The empty mailbox, that was her. He held up the newest crayon letter. So how come she disappeared? The thing that cracked it open was not Josiah. And it was not the lawyer. And it was not $40 million. It was a big tired man named Webb Dolan and his own mother. Webb Dolan had spent 2 years doing secure transports for Meridian and 3 other guardianship outfits, walking resistant wards out of houses and coffee shops and, once, a church, and into vehicles, and telling himself the whole time that they were all really declining, that he was really keeping them safe, that the paperwork was real because there was always paperwork. He needed the money. His own mother was in a facility 2 states over that cost more a month than he cleared. And he worked every transport he could get to keep her in the good one with the garden. And there was an irony in that he did not let himself look at directly, because if he looked at it directly, he could not do the job. Estelle Kingsley made him look at it directly, because Estelle, in the locked wing, did not decline into the wallpaper the way they were supposed to. She organized. She got the addresses of 2 other Meridian wards on her hall by simply asking them, in ink in her notebook, which she'd had the presence of mind to slide into her coat before they walked her out of the coffee shop. She'd known that morning that it might be the last time she was allowed to carry her own things. She held a kind of court in the day room, and when a nearly non-verbal old man named Cecil on her hall was being over-medicated into stillness, because still wards are cheap wards, it was Estelle Kingsley who raised hell about it, who documented it, who parked her wheelchair in front of the med cart and would not move, an 80-year-old woman, with no legal right to her own name, protecting a man who couldn't protect himself. And it was Webb Dolan, working a shift as facility security that week, who was ordered to move her, and who stood there, and could not, because she looked at him, the way she'd looked at Josiah in the coffee shop, all the way in, and she said, "You've got somebody. I can tell. A mother. You're paying for a good one somewhere with what they give you for doing this to us. Do the arithmetic, son. Someday it's her in the chair, and somebody like you they've hired to roll her away from the med cart." She wasn't cruel about it. "I'm not asking you to lose your job. I'm asking you to remember you have a face. When you put us in the car, we see your face. It's the last one some of us see out here. What do you want it to have been?" Webb didn't answer. He rolled her chair back from the med cart, gently, because those were his orders, and she let him. And at the door of the day room, she said the last of it, quiet, just for him. "How much is the good one?" "Your mother's. A month." He told her. He didn't know why he told her. And how many of us do you have to drive away from our own lives to make that number? She wasn't unkind about it. That was the terrible part. "You're a good son, Mr. Dolan. You're just a good son at the wrong people's expense. There's a version of you that figured that out in time. I'm standing in front of the med cart hoping I get to meet him." Webb Dolan went home that night and did not sleep. And in the morning he did not go to Meridian. He went to a legal aid clinic with a coffee-stained attorney's name he'd seen on a challenge filing, and he told Renee Hutton everything. The coached doctors, the fast-tracked emergency petitions, the wards who were sharp as tacks and locked up anyway, the placement fees, the way the whole thing ran. He was a witness on the inside. He was the thing Renee had said cracks these open. And he'd made himself one on purpose, knowing it would cost him the job that kept his mother in the garden, because Estelle Kingsley had made him look at his own face. The hearing was in a small courtroom that smelled like floor wax. On a Thursday, and for the first time in 5 months, Estelle Kingsley was allowed to be in a room where the decisions about her were made. Coulter was very good. Coulter was always very good. She had the doctor, and the emergency order, and a soft, sorrowful account of a declining woman who wandered, who resisted care, who had fixated, that was the word, on a postal employee in a way that itself indicated impaired judgment. She said the word postal employee, the way you'd say stranger. She let the room build the rest, and it was working. You could feel it working. A judge sees 100 of these. The paperwork was in order. The guardian was credentialed. The challenger was a legal aid lawyer with a mail carrier and a crayon letter. Then Renee Hutton called Webb Dolan, and a room that had been running on rails came off them. He was not a slick witness. He was a big, tired man who kept his hands folded and told the truth in a flat voice. And the truth was a pattern. Names, dates, the mechanics of it. The coach doctor he could identify. The 2 other wards on Estelle's hall who were no more incapacitated than he was. He said, "I've walked maybe 60 people out of their lives. I told myself they were all really sick. Most of them weren't. I knew it. You know it when their eyes track you. Sick eyes don't track you. Theirs tracked me every time." He looked at the floor. "I did it for my mom, to keep her somewhere nice, which means I was selling these people to pay for my own. I'd like that on the record, because I'm not any better than Coulter. I just finally couldn't stand my own face." "Mr. Dolan," Renee said, "how many of those 60 came from Meridian Guardianship?" "Most of them. Coulter's the biggest outfit in the county. She runs it like a route. Emergency petition, tame doctor on a Friday, placement fee on the back end. I could name you 6 she filed on this year that I'd bet my truck aren't any sicker than you are." "Objection." Coulter's attorney was on his feet. "The witness isn't qualified to—" "He walked them out of their own front doors," the judge said. "I'll hear it." "There's a man named Cecil," Webb said. "Same hall as Mrs. Kingsley. Can't hardly talk. They keep him snowed on medication because a quiet ward's a cheap ward. Mrs. Kingsley, the woman you're calling incompetent, she's the one been fighting to get his dose read by a real doctor. From a wheelchair, with no rights. That's who you locked up for being confused." And then Estelle Kingsley was allowed to speak. The whole point of the abuse had been that she never was. And she did not rant, and she did not weep. She took a drugstore notebook out of her coat, and she read from it, in ink, in her level, dry voice, 5 months of invoices and dates and names, a forensic account of her own erasure kept by the one instrument they'd forgotten to take away from her, which was her mind. She named the realtor. She named the placement fee. She quoted from memory and from the page the exact hourly rate Beverly Coulter had billed her estate for the meeting in which Coulter decided to sell Estelle's house out from under her. Beverly Coulter said for the first time, and too fast, "Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of confabulation that—" "It's not confabulation if the invoices match," Renee Hutton said, and laid the subpoenaed Meridian billing records next to Estelle's notebook, and they matched, line for line, an old woman's ink against a guardian's ledger, and there is no argument a professional makes against her own numbers in another person's honest hand. But the numbers weren't the moment. The numbers were for the record. The moment came when Coulter, cornered, did the thing cornered guardians do, which is reach for the paper, the order, the finding, the machinery that had made all of it legal. And she held up the guardianship decree and said in the flat institutional voice that had run over Estelle Kingsley for 5 months, "Whatever this room feels, Mrs. Kingsley remains, as a matter of law, a ward, a protected person, the respondent in this matter, case number, and Josiah Rhodes, who had no standing, who was there as a witness to nothing but her being a person, stood up in the gallery, and he said that's not her name. The judge looked at him. Renee winced. Josiah kept going anyway, because he'd been quiet his whole life and it hadn't saved anybody. You keep saying, the ward, the respondent, case number. That's the whole trick, isn't it? You turn a person into a file, and then you can put a file in a drawer and nobody feels bad about a drawer. He reached into his satchel, his mail satchel. He'd come straight off the route, and he took out a folded piece of paper covered in crayon, soft from a coat pocket, and he walked it up and set it on the rail in front of the judge. This came to her house. My 6-year-old wrote it, because I told him her mailbox was always empty, and a kid can't stand an empty mailbox any more than I can. She's got $40 million, and she carried this against her chest for 5 months, because it was the only mail she'd gotten from a human being in years. That's not a case number. That's a person somebody remembered. The courtroom was very quiet. I had a grandmother, Josiah said, and his voice did the thing his voice did, which was go low and steady when it wanted to break. You'd have called her a ward too. She was in a place like the one you're trying to send this woman. And every time I visited, she asked me one thing. Did the mail come? Did anybody write? And the answer was always no. She died checking an empty box, believing that if she was still a person, somebody would have sent something. Nobody did. I was 23 and I told myself I'd go Sunday. He looked at Beverly Coulter. You know what you actually take from them? Not the money. The money's the reason. It's not the crime. The crime is you take away the last estrus anybody has for them. You make them a place mail can't reach. And an old woman with no mail is an old woman the world's agreed to forget. He set his hand flat on the crayon letter. Her mailbox is not going to be empty anymore. I'll see to that personally. It's on my route. 2 women had been erased in that man's life. One who died waiting for a letter, one about to. And both of them met on a folded piece of paper a child had colored. And the judge, who had signed 100 of these orders and would think about this one for a long time, took off her glasses and asked Beverly Coulter to remain, and asked the clerk to note that the court was, effective immediately, suspending the guardianship pending a full review, and appointing independent counsel for Mrs. Kingsley, who appears to this court, the judge said dryly, to be in complete command of her own mind and to keep better records than the professional charged with protecting her. It did not fix cleanly, because these things don't, and Josiah would have distrusted it if it had. The guardianship was suspended that day, but not dissolved for months. The law that made the abuse easy made the undoing slow, and Estelle spent those months proving, over and over, to a parade of evaluators, a mind that had never been in question. The final indignity, being made to demonstrate your own personhood on a schedule. Beverly Coulter did not go to prison the way the room wanted. She lost her license, and her 40-some other wards were reassigned to a scramble of overworked public guardians, some better, some not, and the investigation into Meridian ground forward at the speed of investigations, which is to say, against the clock of old people who don't have the years to spare. It was not a triumph. It was a woman getting her own name back, slowly, and a system barely flinching. Renee Hutton took 9 new cases out of the file boxes Webb's testimony opened, and looked 10 years older doing it, and did it. Webb Dolan lost the transport work, all of it, the way whistleblowers do, and his mother had to move to a lesser facility without the garden. And when Estelle heard about it, she did a thing that was not a reward and not a payoff, because Webb wouldn't have taken either, and she knew it. She got his mother onto the board of the good place as a charity resident, quietly, so it looked like the facility's own program and not like charity, because Estelle Kingsley understood exactly how a proud person can and cannot be helped. She'd spent 5 months as one. Webb never fully forgave himself for the 60 before Estelle. Estelle told him that was correct, that he shouldn't, that the 60 were owed his not forgetting. and that the work now was to make sure the number stopped at 60. It was the least comforting and most useful thing anyone said to him. And it was the thing that let him get up in the mornings. And Estelle tried, exactly once, to give Josiah money. She did it clumsily, because she was out of practice at owing anyone anything. She had a check drawn. She set it on the counter at the Bluebird, at the window table, where she was allowed to sit again, a woman restored to her coffee. And Josiah looked at it, and looked at her, and slid it back across the table with one finger. No, Mr. Rhodes, you give me money. And every person who ever looked at a mail carrier standing near a rich lady's business and thought the worst, they were right. He said it gently. I didn't buy your coffee for 5 months to get a check at the end. If I take it, it turns the whole thing into a transaction, and it wasn't one. And I need it to have not been one, because the last person I loved that I couldn't save, I couldn't pay her back either. And I've spent 15 years learning you can't buy your way out of a thing like that. So, keep your money, Miss Estelle. It's the one thing you've got that I've got no use for. She kept it, and then she asked him the question that mattered, the one Dawn had been trying to make him ask himself. When did you last visit your grandmother's grave? Josiah didn't answer for a while. Never, he said finally. I've never been. 7 years. He turned his coffee cup. I couldn't. If I go, then it's real that I didn't go when it counted. As long as I don't go, some part of me is still about to make it right. You've been running a route for a dead woman, Estelle said, which was the same thing Dawn had said, which meant it was true. Take me. I've buried everyone I ever had. I'm very good at graves. Take me and we'll go together, and you can finally do the one thing you've been avoiding, which is stop trying to earn it and just grieve her. So they went. An 80-year-old heiress and a mail carrier, and a 6-year-old with a rubber band ball, on a gray Sunday, to a cemetery on the edge of the city, to a modest stone that said Odessa Rhodes, and 2 dates and nothing else. Because when she died, there hadn't been money for more words. And Josiah stood in front of it and did the thing he had not let himself do for 16 years, which was not fix anything, and not promise anything, and not pay anything back. Just stand there and be the boy who didn't come on Sunday, and let it hurt all the way down, with an old woman's hand on one arm and his son's hand in the other. And Micah, who did not fully understand and completely understood, took a folded piece of paper out of his pocket. He'd made it that morning without telling anyone. And he set it against the base of the stone, under a rock so the wind wouldn't take it. A crayon letter to a great-grandmother he'd never met. So her mailbox isn't empty either, he said. It did not become a fairy tale. Estelle Kingsley did not adopt them, and Josiah did not get rich, and the guardianship system did not fall. What happened was smaller and truer than that. Estelle got her house back, and her name, and her $40 million, and she looked at all of it, the rugs unrolled, the china cabinet untaped, the life restored, and found she did not much want to sit alone in a tall house, being worth a fortune, having so recently learned what a fortune is worth when nobody writes to you. So she did the thing her money could actually do that mattered. She founded a small program and refused to put her own name on it. She called it Odessa's Route. It was not complicated. It matched volunteers, retirees, church folks, school kids with fat crayons, with old people in facilities, and behind overgrown hedges whose mailboxes were always empty, and the volunteers wrote to them, and visited them, and learned their names, and made sure that no one on any route in that city died the way a woman named Odessa Rhodes had died, checking an empty slot, wondering if she was still a person. Renee Hutton ran the legal side, screening the guardianships, catching the next Coulter earlier. Webb Dolan drove the visits, a big, tired man who had walked 60 people out of their lives and now spent his days making sure people weren't left alone in them. And the mailboxes on the north side, the empty ones Josiah had grieved past for 15 years, started to have something in them. Some months later, there was a morning at the Bluebird with a good kind of noise in it. The window table wasn't empty. Estelle Kingsley did the crossword in ink and argued with a 6-year-old about whether his rubber band ball counted as a sphere. 14 letters, it did not. The answer was something else. She let him win. She'd become, without anyone deciding it out loud, Micah's grandmother. The kind you get late and by choice, which some people will tell you is the best kind, because nobody's obligated, and everybody shows up anyway. And Josiah Rhodes came in off the first half of his route, satchel on his shoulder, and stepped up to the counter, and said the thing he said every morning, except this time he said it out loud. All of it, with no "don't tell her" on the end. "Morning, Dawn. Coffee. And one for the lady at the window." He glanced over. "On me. She can know." And Estelle Kingsley looked up from her crossword and let herself be seen buying and looked at the man who'd spent 5 months refusing to be thanked. And she said, "Thank you, Josiah." Simple, out loud, in front of everybody. "You're welcome, Miss Estelle. Was that so hard?" "Yes, ma'am. Worst part of my day." But he was almost smiling, and she saw it. And she let him have that too. 6 letters, she said, going back to her paper, because that was how the two of them said the soft things. What you finally let somebody do after you spent your whole life sure you didn't deserve it. He thought about it, coming around the counter with her cup. "Thanks? Thanks is a start, but that's not the word." She inked it in without telling him, the way she did, and he never did find out what it was. And it didn't matter, because he was learning to live it instead of solve it, and he let himself take the thank you. Which was, for a man who had spent his whole life sure he hadn't earned a single kind thing, the hardest and best delivery he ever accepted. Micah slid off his stool and ran to the door, because it was almost 8, and he liked to walk the first block of the route with his dad before school, and he had a letter in his hand for a box on Ferndale that used to be empty and never would be again. "Nobody disappears on my route," Josiah Rhodes had told his son once, on a porch, meaning it small. It had turned out to be the largest thing he ever said.